Hey everyone, welcome back to Neural Battlefields. I'm thrilled to have you here today because we're diving into one of the most pivotal moments in human history, a moment so profound that it literally reshaped the world as we know it. This is the story of the fall of Constantinople. The day an empire that had stood for over 1,000 years finally breathed its last. But this isn't just a story about conquest or defeat. It's a story about human ambition, technological innovation, cultural collision, and the dark price civilizations pay when worlds collide. So buckle up, because what you're about to discover will change how you see the medieval world forever. It was May 29, 1453. The sun rises over the walls of Constantinople, the greatest city in Christendom, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. For 53 days, these walls have withstood a relentless siege. The defenders are exhausted, starving, and vastly outnumbered. Outside, an army of over 80,000 Ottoman soldiers prepares for one final, desperate assault. Inside, fewer than 7,000 defenders stand ready to protect everything they hold sacred. Their emperor, Constantine XI, knows this is the end. He removes his imperial regalia, picks up his sword, and prepares to die as a common soldier. Within hours, the most impregnable fortress in the world will fall, and with it, an entire era of human civilization will come to a violent, bloody end. But to understand why this moment matters, we need to go back, way back. Constantinople wasn't just any city. Founded by the Roman Emperor Constantine I in 324 CE, it was strategically positioned at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the vital trade routes between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. For over a millennium, it stood as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire. While Western Europe descended into the chaos of the Dark Ages after Rome's fall in 476, Constantinople remained a beacon of learning, art, culture, and Christianity. It preserved the knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Its libraries held texts that would have been lost forever. Its scholars debated philosophy and theology. Its artisans created works of breathtaking beauty. The city was also virtually impregnable. Protected by the legendary Theodosian walls, a triple-layered defensive system built in the 5th century, Constantinople had repelled siege after siege for centuries. Arabs, Persians, Bulgars, Rus, they all tried and failed. The walls stretched for nearly 6 kilometers, with towers rising up to 20 meters high. To attack Constantinople was to throw yourself against what seemed like the will of God himself. But by the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former glory. What had once controlled vast territories across the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Middle East was now reduced to little more than the city of Constantinople itself and a few scattered territories. The empire had been slowly bleeding out for centuries, weakened by internal strife, economic decline, and constant warfare with its neighbors. The Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Christian crusaders sacked Constantinople instead of fighting Muslims, had been particularly devastating. The empire never fully recovered from that betrayal. Mehmed II, later known as Mehmed the Conqueror, when he became Sultan of the Ottoman Empire in 1451 at just 19 years old, he inherited a powerful, expanding state that had been steadily encroaching on Byzantine territory for decades. But Mehmed was obsessed with one goal above all others: taking Constantinople. It wasn't just about conquest. It was about fulfilling a prophecy, about cementing his legacy, about proving that he was the greatest sultan who had ever lived. He reportedly said, "Either I shall conquer Constantinople or Constantinople shall conquer me." The young sultan was brilliant, ruthless, and willing to embrace innovation in ways that would shock the medieval world. He gathered the finest military minds, engineers, and artisans from across his empire and beyond. He studied the city's defenses obsessively, learning from the failures of previous sieges. And most importantly, he understood something that would change warfare forever. The age of impregnable stone walls was coming to an end. This is where the story gets truly dark and fascinating. Mehmed commissioned the creation of the largest cannons the world had ever seen. A Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantines but was turned away because they couldn't afford him, came to Mehmed with an audacious proposal. He could build a cannon so massive, so powerful, that it could shatter the legendary Theodosian walls. Mehmed gave him unlimited resources, and Urban delivered. The result was a monster of bronze that measured over 8 meters long, weighed nearly 17 tons, and could fire stone balls weighing around 600 kilograms over a distance of more than a kilometer. Just transporting this beast required 60 oxen and hundreds of men. It took 2 hours to reload. When it fired, the sound was said to be heard 16 kilometers away, and pregnant women within the city reportedly miscarried from the shock. This was the weapon that would break the unbreakable. In April 1453, Mehmed's massive army arrived at the walls of Constantinople. The exact numbers are debated by historians, but the Ottomans likely fielded between 80,000 and 120,000 troops, including elite Janissary infantry, cavalry, and thousands of irregular soldiers. They also had a fleet of ships to blockade the city from the sea. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI could muster only about 7,000 defenders, including around 2,000 foreign mercenaries and volunteers, mainly Genoese and Venetian sailors and soldiers. The most famous of these was Giovanni Giustiniani, a skilled Genoese commander who took charge of defending the critical land walls. The defenders knew they were outnumbered more than 10 to 1, but they had hope. They had those magnificent walls. They had a massive chain stretched across the Golden Horn harbor to prevent Ottoman ships from entering. They had sent desperate pleas for help to Western Christian powers. Surely reinforcements would come. Surely God would protect his chosen city. They were wrong. The siege began with the roar of cannons. Day after day, Mehmed's artillery pounded the walls. Urban's great cannon, along with dozens of smaller guns, fired relentlessly. Each shot sent shockwaves through the city. Each impact sent chunks of stone flying. The defenders worked frantically each night to repair the damage, piling rubble, timber, and earth behind the shattered sections. They hung leather hides and bales of wool to absorb the impact, but it was a losing battle. For every section they repaired, the cannons opened new breaches. The psychological warfare was just as brutal as the physical bombardment. The Ottomans would sometimes impale captured defenders on stakes within sight of the walls. They paraded prisoners and threatened to kill them unless the city surrendered. Mehmed offered Constantine generous terms. Surrender the city and you can leave with your life and your people. Constantine refused every time. He knew that surrendering Constantinople meant betraying 1,000 years of history, of culture, of faith. Then Mehmed pulled off a move so audacious it still seems impossible. Remember that chain across the Golden Horn? The one that kept Ottoman ships out of the harbor. Mehmed couldn't break it, so he went around it. Over a single night, his engineers constructed a wooden road greased with animal fat and tallow over the hills behind the Genoese colony of Galata. In an extraordinary feat of engineering, they hauled about 70 ships overland, around the chain, and launched them into the Golden Horn. The defenders woke to find enemy ships inside their protected harbor. It was a devastating blow to morale. As the siege dragged on, conditions inside the city became desperate. Food supplies dwindled, disease spread. The constant bombardment gave no one rest. Religious processions wound through the streets as people prayed for deliverance. Icons that had protected the city for centuries were paraded on the walls, but the cannons kept firing. The walls kept crumbling, and no help came. The promised reinforcements from the West never arrived. The Christian powers of Europe were divided, suspicious of Byzantine orthodoxy, and more concerned with their own political squabbles than with saving Constantinople. A few ships tried to run the blockade with supplies, but it wasn't nearly enough. The Byzantines were alone. By late May, the situation was hopeless. The walls were breached in multiple places. The defenders were exhausted beyond measure. Mehmed prepared for a final, all-out assault. He gave his troops 3 days to rest, pray, and prepare. He promised them the traditional 3 days of looting if they took the city. This was both a reward and a calculated strategy. The promise of plunder would drive his soldiers to fight with savage intensity. The night of May 28 was eerie. The Ottoman camp was silent. No artillery fired. No attacks came. Inside Constantinople, Constantine XI addressed his remaining defenders. Historical accounts vary, but according to tradition, he gave a stirring speech. He thanked them for their bravery. He acknowledged that the end was near. He asked them to fight one more time, to sell their lives dearly, to show the world what Byzantine courage meant. Then he went to the Hagia Sophia, the magnificent cathedral that had stood at the heart of the city for nearly 900 years, and prayed. That night the people of Constantinople packed the Hagia Sophia. Orthodox and Catholic Christians who had been bitterly divided over theological differences prayed together, perhaps for the first time in centuries. They took communion. They sang hymns. They wept. They knew it was goodbye. At 1:00 in the morning on May 29, the final assault began. Mehmed threw his troops at the walls in waves. First came the irregulars and volunteers, expendable troops meant to exhaust the defenders. They came screaming out of the darkness, carrying ladders and grappling hooks, and were met with a hail of arrows, crossbow bolts, stones, and Greek fire, that mysterious Byzantine weapon that burned even on water. Hundreds died. Hundreds more kept coming. Then came the Anatolian regular troops, better trained and equipped. They hit the walls hard, especially targeting the weakest points where the cannons had done the most damage. The fighting was savage, hand-to-hand combat on the walls and in the breaches. Giovanni Giustiniani and his men held the critical sections, fighting with desperate courage. For hours, the defenders threw back assault after assault. But then disaster struck. Giustiniani was wounded, possibly by a crossbow bolt or gunshot that penetrated his armor. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but it was serious enough that he had to be carried from the walls. His men, seeing their commander fall, began to waver. Panic spread. At almost the same moment, some Ottoman soldiers discovered that a small postern gate called the Kirkaporta had been left unlocked. Accounts differ on whether this was an accident or betrayal, but the result was the same. Enemy troops poured through the gate and began attacking the defenders from behind. Then Mehmed unleashed his elite troops, the Janissaries. These were the Sultan's personal guard, slave soldiers taken as children from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained from youth to be the finest warriors in the world. They were disciplined, fanatical, and terrifying. They hit the weakened defenses like a hammer blow. The wall that had stood for 1,000 years finally, truly broke. Emperor Constantine XI, seeing that all was lost, reportedly said, "The city has fallen and I am still alive." He tore off his imperial regalia so that his body would never be identified and dishonored, drew his sword, and charged into the breach. He was never seen again. The last Roman emperor died fighting like a common soldier, defending his city to the bitter end. His body was never conclusively identified among the thousands of corpses. What happened next was the dark truth that history often glosses over. For 3 days, as promised, Mehmed allowed his troops to sack Constantinople. It was a nightmare of rape, murder, and plunder. Soldiers rampaged through the streets, breaking into homes, dragging people out, and killing anyone who resisted. Churches were desecrated, including the Hagia Sophia, where thousands had taken refuge. The people inside were either killed or taken as slaves. Priceless relics, icons, and manuscripts were destroyed or stolen. The streets ran with blood. Estimates suggest that 4,000 people were killed in the initial assault and sacking, while around 50,000 were enslaved. The city's population, which had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands during the empire's peak, but had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 by 1453, was devastated. Entire families were torn apart. A city that had been the center of Christian civilization for over 1,000 years was transformed overnight. On the third day, Mehmed entered the city in triumph. He rode to the Hagia Sophia, which had been the greatest cathedral in Christendom for 916 years. He dismounted, picked up a handful of dust, and poured it over his head in a gesture of humility before God. Then he ordered that the cathedral be immediately converted into a mosque. The Christian mosaics would eventually be plastered over. The cross was replaced with a crescent. The transformation was both symbolic and total. But here's something that often gets overlooked. Mehmed wasn't just a conqueror. He was also a pragmatist and, in some ways, a preserver of culture. After the 3 days of sacking ended, he stopped the violence. He guaranteed protection to the remaining population. He allowed the Orthodox Church to continue functioning and even appointed a new patriarch. He repopulated the city by bringing in Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across his empire, making Constantinople, which would become Istanbul, into a truly cosmopolitan capital. He saw himself not as the destroyer of Rome but as its successor, as Caesar Rum, the Caesar of Rome. So why does this matter? Why does the fall of one city in 1453 qualify as the end of the medieval world? First, it was the final, definitive end of the Roman Empire. That empire, which had begun with Augustus in 27 BCE, which had shaped Western civilization more than any other political entity, was finally, truly gone. The last thread connecting the modern world to classical antiquity was severed. Second, it changed the geopolitical map of the world. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the vital trade routes between East and West. This would eventually drive European powers to seek new routes to Asia, leading directly to the age of exploration. Columbus's voyage to the Americas in 1492 was, in part, a consequence of the fall of Constantinople. The world would never be the same. Third, it triggered a mass migration of Greek scholars, philosophers, and artists to Western Europe, particularly Italy. They brought with them ancient texts, knowledge, and ideas that had been preserved in Constantinople's libraries. This influx of classical learning helped fuel the Renaissance, that explosion of art, science, and human achievement that would pull Europe out of the Middle Ages and into the modern world. In a very real sense, the death of Constantinople gave birth to the Renaissance. Fourth, it demonstrated that the old order was finished. The age of knights, castles, and impregnable stone walls was over. Gunpowder and cannons had changed everything. Warfare would never be the same. The feudal system that had defined medieval Europe was becoming obsolete. The modern world, with its centralized states, professional armies, and technological innovation, was beginning. And fifth, it created a psychological shift in the Christian world. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had been seen as protected by God himself, the city of cities, the new Rome, the center of Eastern Christianity. Its fall was traumatic, apocalyptic even. It shook the faith of millions and forced a reckoning with the idea that God favored Christendom over all other faiths. It contributed to the religious turmoil that would eventually lead to the Protestant Reformation. But let's talk about the human cost, the dark truth that doesn't make it into most history books. Beyond the numbers, beyond the strategic implications, this was a human tragedy of immense proportions. Families were destroyed. A culture that had existed for over a millennium was shattered. People who had lived their entire lives in Constantinople, whose ancestors had lived there for generations, lost everything. Children watched their parents killed. Women were violated and enslaved. Men were slaughtered or marched off in chains. Ancient knowledge was destroyed in the chaos. Works of art that can never be recreated were burned or melted down for their gold. And there's a particular irony, a dark twist to this story. Remember the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Christian crusaders sacked Constantinople. That betrayal by fellow Christians fatally weakened the Byzantine Empire. It created a bitterness between the Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic churches that persists to this day. When Constantinople desperately needed help in 1453, the division sown by that earlier betrayal meant that help never came. The city fell in part because Christians couldn't put aside their differences to save Christendom's greatest city. The lesson here is brutal. Civilizations often fall not just because of external enemies, but because of internal division, because people who should be allies become enemies, because short-term thinking and petty rivalries blind us to existential threats. Today, if you visit Istanbul, you can still see the Theodosian walls, or what remains of them. You can visit the Hagia Sophia, which is now a museum, then a mosque again as of 2020, its Christian mosaics uncovered once more. You can walk the streets where history was made, where an empire died and a new world was born. But the ghosts are still there, the echoes of that final, desperate battle, the prayers of the people who knew they were living through the end of their world. The courage of Constantine XI, who chose to die with his city rather than abandon it. The fall of Constantinople teaches us something profound about human civilization. It shows us that nothing, no matter how powerful or how sacred, lasts forever. It reminds us that technological change can render old certainties obsolete overnight. It demonstrates that the consequences of our actions, whether the Fourth Crusade or political divisions, can echo through centuries. And it proves that in the darkest moments, human courage and dignity can shine through, even in defeat. Mehmed the Conqueror achieved his dream, but at what cost? He gained a city, but he also destroyed something irreplaceable. He became a legend, but he also became the man who extinguished a light that had burned for over 1,000 years. History remembers him as a great conqueror, one of the most successful military leaders of all time. But history also remembers what was lost. The medieval world ended on May 29, 1453, not with a whimper but with the roar of cannons, the clash of steel, and the cries of a dying empire. What rose from those ashes was the modern world, with all its possibilities and all its horrors. We are still living in the world that was born that day, still dealing with the divisions and conflicts that were crystallized in that moment when East met West at the walls of Constantinople. So the next time you think about the medieval period, about knights and castles and the clash of civilizations, remember that it all came to an end on that spring day in 1453. Remember the courage of those who fought on both sides, believing they were fighting for something greater than themselves. Remember the civilians who suffered and died. Remember the knowledge that was preserved and the knowledge that was lost. And remember that civilizations rise and fall, that nothing is permanent, and that the choices we make today will echo through the centuries, just as the fall of Constantinople still echoes today. This was the fall of Constantinople, the dark truth about the end of the medieval world. It's a story about power and faith, technology and tradition, courage and cruelty. It's a story about the end of one world and the beginning of another. And it's a story that we need to remember because the lessons it teaches about division, innovation, resilience, and the fragility of civilization are as relevant today as they were over 570 years ago. If this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal moments fascinated you, if you learned something new about how our modern world was forged in the fires of medieval conflict, then do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this video with anyone who loves history, and subscribe to Neural Battlefields for more content that explores the conflicts, the strategies, and the human stories that shaped our world. Drop a comment below and let me know what historical event you want me to cover next. There are so many more battles, so many more turning points, so many more dark truths waiting to be explored. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay curious, stay questioning, and never forget that history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding who we are and where we're going. This is Neural Battlefield, signing off.